All right, so back to this. Wanted to talk about this because I'm not quite yet done with this series, as is apparent by the title of this video and in what I'm making it on, right? What if Jax hadn't fumbled Ribbit? And, I'm going to put Ribbit and Pomni in because the, bluff, I guess, right? Or, essentially what's the term? The short story, right? Or what's the phrase? What's the term, right? Long story short, that's what it is. Long story short, essentially, I think it was inevitable that Jax would fumble Ribbit, right? I think that was an inevitability. But I do think Pomni, he had an actual chance with it. And let me kind of get into it now. So I think and this is all coming out post episode 9. Now that we actually know what happened between them, I think, so first things first, right? There's the question about what if Kaufmo never rang the doorbell, right? Some people probably be like, oh yeah, they immediately start cracking, right? I don't think that's the case. I think it would be essentially the same thing would happen, I think, where he would realize, oh shit, he because he had that moment of clarity when he thought he was oversharing, then, Ribbit put the bow on him, right? Blush, got him on his feels, right? But I do think that even if Kaufman hadn't rang the doorbell, I think what people would want to say is oh yeah, he was able to if he wasn't interrupted, not that they would immediately crack, but that, they would be comfortable. He'd be in a place of comfort, right? He overshared, overstepped his what he perceived to be overstepped his boundaries, and she was able to comfort him, be like, oh no, that's not the case. I trust you. I wouldn't betray that, right? And I hope you can trust me, and ultimately she did never give up his secret, right? Nobody else knew besides, and then her, and then eventually Pomni, because she went through his memories. So I think people would want to say that, but I just think given the nature of his character and with how much we've seen that he essentially refused to basically try to make up what they had. We got a whole literal montage of him essentially ignoring Ribbit, right? So I think the reality is if Jax was the type of person to potentially come back from that interaction, right, then that would have played out in his subsequent interactions where if Jax had the potential to make up with Ribbit, right, that would have happened in those other interactions we see. Instead, we see him continue to neglect Ribbit, continue to push her away, again, have that argument with her or whatnot. And then by the chance, I guess, where he comes around, she's already gone. So I think the reality is that, okay, let's assume Kaufman doesn't ring the doorbell. I still think that Jax would probably even if let's say they're comfortable in the time being, I think it would only be a matter of time until another event, or let's say he has time on his own and is able to reflect on what had happened. It's only a matter of time till he fumbles Ribbit. I think that's an inevitability. I think if we're being real with what we've seen between them, it was just an inevitability that he fumbled her, right? That's just inevitable. There's nothing that can really prevent that, if we're being entirely honest. As much as I hate to say it, that ship has sailed. Realistically, Ribbit and Kaufman are dead, right? Ribbit, Jax fumbles Ribbit dies, Kaufman goes crazy. And that leads us into the next part, right? It is Pomni. I think Pomni was different, right? And I think Pomni was different in the sense that, again, by this point, Jax had already gone through, everything that happened previously, right? And getting to the point, really, I'd say episode 6, or just the, whatever, in the whatever point in the series, right, where he starts to see Pomni in Ribbit. And I think that's a time where, because Lord knows how much time it's been. That is one thing the show, I guess, to be fair, the show starts out with Kaufman's abstraction, so it does have a kind of rough reference or time frame, right? So it shouldn't have been too long after Ribbit had gone, but really it starts when Jax sees Pomni and Ribbit, and that's something where I do think the potential there for him to kind of rectify with his past and what had done could play out, right? Although I do think that, again, the manner in which it would need to happen is it's very hard to visualize, but I do think it could happen. I think it could happen with funny enough, one thing we were very derived of in the show is a Jax Kinger conversation, right? I mean, Kinger kind of ends up being, you know, the comfort character for the main cast, right? And that's one conversation we didn't get, and I think it's deliberately done that way. It was one between Kinger and Jax. I think if we had seen a potential Kinger-Jax conversation, right, you know, maybe instead of a Zubul-Jax or Zubul, like, let's say Zubul-Kane. Like, you remember Zubul and Kane's conversation, like, in, you know, very, like, early on, where, like, she just completely didn't go on whatever bullshit adventure he had planned. Like, we could have something like that, but with the extent it would be Jax and then it would be Kinger, right? And we could have gotten more of a, I'd say, I don't want to say we would have gotten the same sequence that Pomni saw when he abstracted and then she, like, went in his mind and had seen how he viewed all of them. Like, I don't want to say we would have gotten that exact scene, but we could have gotten something similar regarding, oh, here's how Jax views everyone, here's why he's a jerk. Okay, maybe that's when they introduced the backstory in Ribbit. Like, I think that is something that could have potentially happened in that way, shape, or form that we didn't get, right? You know, and then potentially, you know, that could lead to, you know, a scenario where, let's say he does argue with Pomni and then he kind of realizes he strikes the connection, but rather than push her away as he did, you know, twice, well, I guess not literally once, figuratively once, well, I guess technically literally both times, right, as in the case of his mother, but, like, that's, you know, a separate thing, right? That's just his lingering guilt and regret from the real world. But for the sake of this, right, he sees Pomni as, like, Ribbit, right? Instead of pushing her away again, you know, like, maybe whatever conversation with Kinger would allow him to, like, essentially realize that, you know, he messed up in the past, right? But that doesn't necessarily need to be the present moving forward. He can accept what he had done, you know, and again, like, acknowledge and come to terms with it, right? Not via the coping the way he does, but by, you know, realizing that, because Pomni has fundamentally, you know, changed the circus, right? And I'll talk about that later in terms of how they literally changed Kane, you know, and altered Kane's worldview. So Pomni isn't, like, you know, some pushover, right? She's not like any other member of the circus. She's special, right? So maybe, you know, he realizes through whatever conversation with Kinger, through Pomni being different, that ultimately him pushing Ribbit away in the past was a mistake that he made, but that he doesn't need to continue doing it in the future. And then, you know, and then ultimately, like, as we had seen, right, you know, Pomni does care for him, right? More than she has any right to, and more than anyone in the circus has any right to, given what he's done to them. But maybe she can bring him around and make him realize that, you know, ultimately, that the way his coping and his outlet isn't the only way, right? And I think it's kind of funny to imagine, I guess, talk about, because I think if he, let's say that happened, right, and he ended up, you know, Pomni and Kinger kind of brought him around, I think Kane, they would still have their argument with Kane, right? And because really, like, I've talked about this in my, like, theory videos, or not theory, but, like, my episode review, how they do Kane, because Kane has the ultimate power in the circus, so how they do his character impacts the rest of the entire show. And the direction they went with his character, especially in the finale, literally is the outcome of the show. He lets them have control, lets them know about them true selves, and they live happily ever after. So that is literally as a result of Kane and them having turned him around, right? So how they do Kane is what, you know, affects or impacts the entire show. So I think ultimately they would still have the argument Kane. But a funny thought experiment I had is, let's say Jax wasn't a complete fucking idiot and asshole, right? Let's say Jax did not fumble, like, also generational fumble, by the way. Like, dude's fumble killed, like, it killed 3 people, himself included. Like, actually insane, like, probably the worst fumble in, like, all of history, if we're being entirely real. Like, but if Jax hadn't fumbled Ribbit, right? Like, let's say he hadn't fumbled Ribbit, he actually, I don't want to say he would get in a relationship with Ribbit, right, or anything, but, like, they'd still stay good friends. Kaufman wouldn't go crazy looking for an exit, right? So, like, ultimately, and then the show plays out as normal, right? With the exception being, you know, you have Jax, Ribbit, and Kaufman. I think there's a decent chance that ultimately they never really have that confrontation with Kane, because the whole reason they ended up having that confrontation with Kane, right, and looking for a way out is because of, like, you know, their dissatisfaction with the circus, and their issues with the circus, right, and kind of the problems. And a lot of it was brought on about by Pomni, right? But I think if we're being real, because that was a point where they really didn't have that much to lose, right? And I think I bring that up in the sense of them not having much to lose, because I think and this is an interesting thing to think about, like if Jax in the gang, Jax, Ribbit, Cosmo, right, if they were all still there, right, and ultimately Jax wasn't the dick he was, and then everyone else in the circus could actually get along, I think the notion of them trying to rebel against Kane would probably not be a thing. And I think it would, because ultimately they would have a lot more to potentially lose in the circus, right? Granted, I guess you could argue that loss is an inevitability, right? It's kind of an inevitability that Kane, unless he goes through that reform, he's going to keep pushing people away. It's going to keep causing people to abstract. It's only a matter of time or inevitability until an event tips them off, right? So debatably, even if Jax, doesn't fumble Ribbit entirely, it's quite possible that one of them still abstract for one reason or another, right? And again, that would create kind of the conditions of, okay, now they don't really feel as though they have a ton left to lose in the circus, right, to rebel against Kane. So, which again, kind of funny that I bring all this up in a video about Jax fumbling, right? Like Jackson's fumble count, like actually probably the worst fucking fumbler in all of like cartoon television history. Like honestly, like all of India, like this guy like needs a worst fumbler award ever. Like I don't think anyone's gonna be as bad as him, but it's funny because, like, let's say he, in a video, again, I'm talking about him fumbling, right? Him fumbling or not fumbling, right? It's quite possible that, she still abstracts anyway. Like, Ribbit still abstracts. And then, like I said, that creates the condition. So, I talk about this, right? But Kane really is the key to everything because he just literally controls the fucking circus. So, Jax could not fumble Ribbit. Kane could do something that would still cause her to abstract. Right, it's just funny. Something funny that's, I don't want to say funny, but it's almost like sad to think about, right? Just the sheer level of control that he has, which is, to be fair, like, I mean, when you look at sort of some of the, I don't want to, God forbid I use this term, like meta horror aspect, some of like the meta aspect, like the sheer volume of control and absolute power that Kane has, and just the sheer, like the sheer power imbalance between Kane and essentially everyone, like, basically, like, no, it's all like almost no matter what anyone else does, it honestly doesn't matter. And it's only until Pomni comes by where she's actually able to put him in a position that would change him, right? And allow them to, actually, like, quote unquote beat him, right? Or overcome his rage tendencies, right? His negative tendencies. So until that happens, like, it almost doesn't really matter. Like, there's going to be like kind of a crazy conclusion, but Jax's fumbling of Ribbit is almost, well, I said inevitable, right? But it's almost like indifferent. Like, it's almost like, irrelevant whether or not he had fumbled Ribbit, because it's quite possible that someone just takes the hit anyway, pending on whatever, what's the term, flavor of the day that Kane has cooked up in store, right? Like, so that is just something I want to talk about, where, like, even though we joke about, like, Jackson and Ribbit, whatnot, Jax, Pomni, like, we joke about the fumbling, which, let's say that as if it's like an event, like the fucking rumbling, but the fumbling, it's something where, like, it's almost irrelevant, just because, like, so long as Kane still has absolute power in the circus, like, nothing that goes on between the characters is actually relevant. Because, like, they're all as women anyway. He can just kill them all off, like, immediately if he want to. Like, he's not going to. But, like, that is just something that could happen given the nature of the show, right? And I want to make this video because, like, okay, like, yeah, obviously talk of the town, right? Dude, this guy's fucking horrible, like, when it comes to, like, speaking with women, right? But like, I was gonna say, I say that as if, like, I'm any better. At least, my fumbling doesn't have a freaking 300% mortality rate, which is insane statistic. But again, it's like, it almost doesn't matter. But I'm gonna end this here because this isn't a serious video. It's not meant to be super long, unlike my last post episode now, which was like 40 minutes. But yeah, with that, don't really much else to say. So yep, that's it for this one. See you in the next one.